Hello, dear friends. My congratulations with those who celebrate the old Russian New Year. We have celebrated it yesterday. Today, I would like to talk about very rich people like Kushner and Witkov, who represents oligarchs, and they try to make money, not war, in Ukraine and in the Middle East. So I would like to compare their efforts with some other efforts of oligarchs in Russia and other countries. So let's start because it's very important to my mind to understand who is responsible for peace and prosperity in our time all over the world.
Oligarchs, hierarchs and the military from time immemorial, the rich and influential have created the military up to their interests. The super rich in ancient Greece were called oligarchs, and influential charismatics were called hierarchs, often also with a lot of money, but not necessarily from their own pocket. They could also rely, like Vladimir Lenin in Russia, for example, on money from outsiders who were interested in him as a charismatic leader. The stream is divided into two parts. The first deals with the oligarchy and the military. The second one is about the hierarchs and the military. Here are a few words to explain my methodology that you should familiarize yourself with three previous streams to see a changing influence of the military on the political and social animals inside the civil military soup. Then try to understand how the modern oligarchs might feed both the military and their political regulators inside that zoo. And, last but not least, try to foresee the role of the hierarchs of 2026-2027. All those streams have been launched recently, DAC.31, January 12th. I will also touch on the important topic of the loss of the trust as the basis of social well-being, according to the theory of Francis Fukuyama, and compared it with the topic of zero trust in the U.S. National Security Strategy 2025 and beyond it. The problem of the distrust to the existing political regimes is completely new for the post-Soviet military and the very topic of global cybersecurity. I will talk about it in a stream dedicated to the Putin doubles factor, and after that I intend to look at the internal digital perestroika in the mentality of the military and society through the activation of some kinds of civil society. Now civilians are equipped with ITAI to strengthen their positions not only with money, but also with new meanings through hierarchical groups from the tunnels of genetic memory. Well-known hierarchs of 2026-2027 Witkoff and Kushner have made interesting results in peacekeeping in the Middle East and Ukraine, which are still infuriating old schoolers inside the military and diplomacy of many post-Soviet countries. But the most important conclusion I have got in my recent studies is the increasing role of the digitized masses in the revolution of common sense unleashed by Trump 47 and his faithful ally Elon Musk. No one will argue that AI has been invented and spread precisely with the money of the oligarchy of North America around the world since 1999. And now from there come generative AI platforms from one oligarchs as sort of spiritual hierarchs for many US and global mass media try to legalize their political ambitions. Moreover, two, there is a digitalization of poorly organized segments of the population in opposition to the authorities with the Starlink platforms in Iran and far beyond this country as an example. But also there is as a result of the second factor, three, digitalization of the military by the oligarchs with all its plus minus and contacts with the authorities. These are to become topics for 2-3 more streams of mine. The Mamdani inauguration oath on January 1st, 2026 on the Quran has made him a pure Muslim mayor of New York and the direct challenge to the Christian oligarchs of the United States with their old and new connections in the military, which Trump 47 reset with digitalization effectively within just 1 year. And now let's pay attention to the fact that in Russia in the 1900s, without the oligarch Savo Morozov, there would have been no Maxim Gorky as Lenin's secret financier. And after a successful military seizure of power in 1917, Lenin had his own U.S. oligarch Armand Hammer along with others, and also from Europe. The money of that oligarchy went to Soviet Russia through Jacob Sverdlov, Leo Trotsky, and Lazar Kaganovich. The U.S. oligarchs continued to finance the USSR armed forces under Joseph Stalin, Nikita Khrushchev, and Leonid Brezhnev, always through secret, barter deals worth dollar billions, and at the dollar exchange rate today, it costs already trillions of US dollars. According to the above-mentioned money pressure model, Trump 47 is fighting for peace in Ukraine and around it, relying on their own oligarchy, but presenting himself as a spiritual leader in the revolution of common sense. In short, Trump 47 has become a sort of spiritual hierarch in the Western Hemisphere with his Monroe Doctrine too and non-military tools. For example, in the USSR, grain from Canada was used for gold and paintings from the reserves of Tsarist Russia. Ford factories and plants were built for gold from Spain. With it, dictator and fascist Franco paid Stalin for his help in the Civil War and the rallying of the military of fascists in Spain, Italy, and Germany, with the later participation of Stalin's military experts against agents of Leo Trotsky in Spain, Italy, and Japan. This is a sort of explanation how the multipolar Second World War under the supervision of those oligarchs was also born and developed. My stream on oligarchs for digitalization versus wars will be later. So, any war in the military always need three things: money, money, and again money. The special military operation in Ukraine should be ended by January 20th under the Trump's money pressure by his oligarchs. Let's have a look at the $200 billion US Russian investment fund to crush the $90 billion Ukraine EU NATO fund for war for peace against the Russian Federation and then against the United States. This pressure might be realized by January 20th, as well as a peaceful deal between Trump 47 and Iran's mullahs at power or out of power. Who is against the end of the SMO in Ukraine by January 20th? These are old schoolers among diplomats and the military. But they are not the ones who make war, not money. They spend money from the oligarchs of the USA, Russia, Ukraine to continue the war to the last Ukrainian with money from the EU NATO bureaucracy. The militarized bureaucracy is in panic after the cessation of the flow of oil for the SMO from Venezuela after Maduro's arrest with the excellent special operation by Trump 47. I guess it was the AI that planned Maduro's arrest in several stages. At first, the Nobel Peace Prize 2025 served for that scenario when it was given to Maduro's opponent, and she dedicated it to Trump 47. Now her electorate has gladly supported the arrest of Maduro and without unnecessary casualties and material losses for Venezuela's well-being. How did the oligarchs of the Russian Federation appear? And why did President Yeltsin not choose a mentor of normal oligarchs for the economic growth of the Russian Federation, namely the libertarian Friedrich von Hayek with his open society and the same military, open to civilian control? No, Yeltsin, alas, chose the beaten path of state bureaucratic capitalism, relying on friend Billy Clinton with those of his oligarchs around the U.S. Democratic Party. And they did not support the middle class, as then a Soviet academician Stanislav Shatalin proposed in his 400 Days program, but oligarchic capitalism in the Russian Federation with its 7 bankers were against this plan. This was also helped by the hidden servant of the U.S. Demos, Gregory Yavlensky. The 7 bankers with their private armies finished off the remnants of moral strength and elementary conscience inside of the collapsed USSR armed forces. See my stream of the 31 Street of December. Boris Yeltsin was captive to prejudices about the influence of the communists led by Gennady Zyuganov. In fact, there was a total rejection of the communist yoke after Gorbachev's Perestroika, relying on the oligarchs around the Republican Party of the United States. It is not surprising that Yeltsin became a hostage of a group of influential oligarchs known as the 7 Bankers with its ties to the U.S. Democratic Party in power since 1992. is associated with the oligarchy only around the U.S. Democratic Party and the RINO with the victory of Democratic President Clinton in 1992 and 1996. Those oligarchs, both with their capital and through the U.S. federal treasury, helped the seven bankers to seize banks, media and industrial assets in the Russian Federation, which are key for the development of the country. Russian oligarchs received all those resources almost for free during the privatization by Anatoly Chubais. At that time, oligarchic clans began to be quickly mobilized with that crazy money in a poor country to construct some kind of illegal agent networks of mainly quite innocent managers, politicians and business partners loyal to Yeltsin and his sponsors oligarchs of the United States. Weapons concealed or simply stolen during the defense conversion allowed those oligarchs in the Russian Federation and the CIS to create private security companies, PSs. In the legal chaos of the 1990s, they functioned as private armies to protect the interests of rival oligarchic clans. For example, Boris Berezovsky and Vladimir Gusinsky had hundreds of armed employees that were used in corporate wars. According to AI Growth, by the 2000s, there were hundreds of thousands of people with a gun in private security companies in the post-Soviet space. And only in 2020, the figure of 700,000 people in PSCs appeared. I am sure that this figure was and now is higher. Thus, President Yeltsin's rejection of the sanity of the libertarian Hayek turned out to be in favor of the sharks of big financial capitalism like George Soros. In the 1980s, he softly prepared to sleep, but it was hard to sleep for the capitalists he deceived in Asian countries and his clients in the UK. Therefore, George Soros elegantly moved the $1 billion earned in this way as philanthropy and without paying taxes to the Russian Federation to Yeltsin and something to the CIS countries. His innocent-looking Open Society Foundation was active in the Russian Federation throughout the 1990s until 2015. Initially, the American billionaire and philanthropist George Soros supported the infrastructures of science, education, libraries, thick magazines, and civil society in forms of NGOs for his future active work in the field of global economy and politics. It was he who taught how to withdraw the money without paying taxes by the oligarchs of the Russian Federation and CIS from their countries to offshores and thereby slow down the growth of domestic SMEs and the reform of the military in favor of the middle class. Although publicly George Soros met with Boris Yeltsin personally in 1993, and his foundation promoted supposedly open reforms in accordance with Karl Popper's ideals of developing democracy in society and the armed forces through glasnost and renewal of political system. But under Soros, numerous shadow channels were created for withdrawing money for business development abroad, through offshore companies, but not within the country, where they were opened. Soros scared everyone with corruption, encouraging huge money runaway. At the same time, Yeltsin and his entourage did not see Soros, as well as other U.S. oligarchs, to become their allies for several reasons. 1. The seven bankers simply and stupidly provided Yeltsin with direct assistance in the 1996 campaign through their personal billions of rubles in cash for election campaigning and control over all major TV channels. Those oligarchs deliberately inflated the threat of communism for their long-hidden assets. That is why they united among themselves, despite internal conflicts. And Soros was a foreigner for them without direct access to the Russian media or financial flows. His foundation focused on long-term projects, rather than on saving a particular politician Boris Yeltsin from Vladimir Putin or Eugene Primakov. Soros did not participate in the financing of Yeltsin's election and did not have his own clans within the Russian elite. Therefore, that elite did not protect him when he was expelled by Vladimir Putin in 2015. Power and control. Those oligarchs of the 1990s were part of the Russian bureaucratic system. The New Russians emerged from a feverish and unfair privatization. George Soros soon turned from his oligarch into an external player, allegedly guilty of the devaluation of the ruble in 1998, as well as of the malicious destruction of Soviet science by luring talents abroad. Many of those Soros fugitives became aides to the U.S. Democratic Party in its confrontation with the Republican Party. In particular, they went to the environmental sector of economy, helping the Democratic Party's bureaucrats to crush the business of Republicans and Democrats in America with bribes, which are the reason of the increasingly high runaway of capitals from Russia and CIS to the Third World and China. Some of those chicks of Soros' nest oppose Trump's MAGA movement in 2026, including the MIGA, Make Iran Great Again. The ideological and geopolitical context of the oligarch Soros in his open society implied liberal reforms, transparency and the fight against corruption, which ran counter to the clan system of oligarchs both in the United States and the Russian Federation. Only Trump 47 fantastically successfully managed to reconcile many of the previously warring clans of oligarchs in 2023-2026. This reconciliation is the core of the common sense revolution that is reflected in the programs of MAGA, MAHA, MIGA, etc. movements. For Boris Yeltsin, and then for Vladimir Putin, political power was built on non-transparent deals, which were protected from the tax authorities by private armies. Yeltsin, being a pragmatist, preferred local temporaries, even from regional organized crime groups, who ensured the survival of his regime under conditions of constant chaos. Naturally, the supposedly abstract ideals of Hayek and Popper, which I studied abroad and with Soros's payment for study, went downhill. In addition, George Soros suddenly became an agent of the insidious West for the pro-communist and paranoid Kremlin under President Putin, like all the fellows of the Soros Open Society. Especially, it happened because of the hysteria after the default of 1998, as well as after the seizure of Crimea by the Kremlin in 2014. In the struggle for the political power and the military, there was a strengthening of oligarchic capitalism, which Putin later used to limit the influence of the same oligarchs close to the U.S. Democratic Party, which gave rise to the myth of his alleged control over Trump 45. It was Yigal Gator who proposed von Hayek's ideas about the open society to President Yeltsin. At that time, they were generously financed by Soros through his foundation. However, Yeltsin supported all those ideas in words, but in fact he transferred the economy to anti-Semitic and xenophobic clans of bankers with their private armed structures. In fact, these were illegal organized crime groups in the regions of the Russian Federation and the CIS. That is why the 7 bankers replaced Yeltsin with Putin as their alleged puppet. And he dispersed the 7 bankers, carrying out a reform in the military, putting forward the special secret services. The oligarchs who controlled the mass media and finance saw Boris Yeltsin as a guarantor of their assets, but they understood the need for a change of leader to maintain influence. They supported Vladimir Putin, then director of the FSB and prime minister, as a manageable candidate, hoping that he would become their tool to protect their interests from the opposition, the communists, a union of Primakov-Leskov with their own oligarchy. Motives of old and new oligarchs. Vladimir Putin seemed loyal and weak to Yeltsin's old oligarchs. As a former Chekist with no political experience, but with a reputation for decisiveness, for example, after the constructing pseudo-terrorist attacks of 1999 for justifying the beginning of the Second Chechen War, which raised his ratings, Boris Berezovsky openly stated that he created Putin by financing his campaign through the TV media, ORT, and lobbying in the family of Yeltsin, daughter Tatyana Duchenko, son-in-law Valentin Yumashev. The oligarchs were afraid of losing power. If Eugene Primakov had won, he could have reconsidered privatization. Putin promised the equidistance of the oligarchs from power, and they interpreted this as his protection of his small clan interests. Yeltsin's role. Yeltsin himself chose Putin for his decisiveness and trust. He wanted a successor who would protect his family from persecution with immunity. Yeltsin's early resignation on December 31st, 1999 made Putin acting president, giving him an advantage in the 2000 fake elections. As a result, the oligarchs underestimated Putin. They thought he would be a figurehead, like Yeltsin after 1996, but he quickly consolidated power. How and why did Putin disperse the seven bankers with reforms in the armed forces, promoting small clan interests of special services? Putin did not disperse the seven bankers directly through military reforms. It was a set of measures, prosecutions, nationalization, and redistribution of assets under the military. Reforms of the armed forces and the strengthening of the special services served to strengthen the vertical of power, where the Siloviki, the FSB, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and the National Guard became the backbone of the regime, and the armed forces became an instrument of foreign policy, but with less autonomy. And here I have to remind you of Ben Abrahamson's ideas of political autonomy of the military. The more autonomy there is, the more real military coups are to occur. Putin has reduced the military's autonomy to a minimum. How the seven bankers dispersed, which shackled the military with private security companies, PSCs. Direct Action, 2000-2003. There was a meeting with oligarchs in 2000, where Putin demanded equidistance, not to interfere in politics in exchange for keeping their unlawful military business untouched. The centers suffered. Vladimir Gusinsky emigrated after his arrest, MTV was nationalized. Boris Berezovsky fled to London. Michael Khodorkovsky was arrested in 2003 for tax crimes. Yukos was dismantled in favor of Rosneft. The role of reforms in the armed forces and the rise of special services. The military reform, 2008-2020 under Anatoly Sergeyevkov and Sergei Shoigu included a reduction of the officer corps from 355,000 to 220,000. The transition to a contract system, the creation of Special Operations Forces, SOF, under the direct control of the General Staff for hybrid operations. This made the military more effective, but dependent on the Kremlin. The special services have strengthened. The FSB has received more powers in counterintelligence. The National Guard, created in 2016 from the internal troops of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, has become Putin's personal army with 340,000 people, tanks and aircraft to suppress internal threats. There were far fewer threats to the United States and Europe. Why was it necessary? Consolidation of political power. Oligarchs with private armies posed a threat to the Kremlin from within the Russian Federation, as in the 1990s, when they influenced the regions to become self-governing. Putin replaced them with Siloviki, those who came from the special services, Igor Sechin, Nikolai Patrushev, loyal to him personally. The special services, FSB, were better suited for internal control than the army, which traditionally saw itself as the defender of the people and could be disloyal to the Kremlin, as in 1991 or 1993. Protection from threats. After the color revolutions and protests, 2011-2012, Putin strengthened counterintelligence and internal troops, seeing the West as the enemy and the organizer of color revolutions. The military was reformed for external conflicts, Chechnya, Georgia, Ukraine, Syria, and the special services were reformed to suppress dissidents and their oligarch sponsors. Economic aspect. The dispersal of the former oligarchs made it possible to redistribute resources in favor of the centralization of the Moscow autocracy. Financing reforms, military spending rose to 4-5% of GDP, which strengthened the Kremlin's regime. Now military spending is 7.1% of GDP in general. Putin used the oligarchs to come to power, and then eliminated their influence to build a system where the special services are a key tool of domestic control and the military is a subordinate element. This reflected a transition from the oligarchic chaos of the 90s to an authoritarian hierarchical, vertical, like the mullahs in Iran with their IRGC under the crash by Trump 47. But from 2026, everything is now moving towards horizontal cyber self-defense of the former regions of the Russian Federation with latent city-states and their territorial self-defense, as in Japan or, probably, in Ukraine finally segmented into several phases after the end of the SMO sooner or later. The completion of the SMO in Ukraine is due to the fact that the oligarchs in the Russian Federation turned out to be suckers in the digital and distant war. But they have a chance to assert themselves in the digitalization of the struggle for peace together with the United States under Trump. In general, Putin used the oligarchs to come to power, and then eliminated their influence to build a system where the special services are a key tool of control and the military is a subordinate element. This reflected a transition from the oligarchic chaos of the 90s to the authoritarian, vertical, and the SMO's end reveals the horizontal power of digital control, not so much of the military over the population, but of civilian control via AI in the pockets of citizens to monitor over the military and later on over the special services. Why doesn't Vladimir Putin have oligarchs for peace talks on Ukraine and other hotspots with US fellow oligarchs? No way. It cannot be definitively stated that by 2026 Putin will have no oligarchs left for potential negotiations on Ukraine or other conflicts with Trump's trusted oligarchs. Although the influence of the traditional oligarchs of the 1990s has weakened significantly, and many of them have lost political autonomy or emigrated, a new elite of loyal business people and oligarchs, who come from the special services and are close to Putin, who continue to play a certain role in the economy and diplomacy. These figures, such as Genevieve Timchenko, Arkady Boris Rotenberg, Yuri Kovalchuk or Igor Sechin, retain significant assets and can be used as intermediaries in unofficial contacts, but strictly under the control of the Kremlin. Their role in the negotiations on Ukraine is limited. For example, Roman Abramovich participated in the early rounds, 2022, including the grain deal and prisoner exchanges, but by 2025-2026 such initiatives have become rare, and the oligarchs have generally shut up or integrated into the war economy, supplying material resources for the SMO. Western sanctions and Putin's domestic policies have led to the oligarchs losing their independence. Those who criticized the war, like Oleg Tinkov or Mikhail Friedman, lost their assets or left for a while, although then returning, and the loyal, more than half of the Forbes list, benefited from the war, increasing their fortunes amid rising resource prices. This is not elimination but redistribution. Putin uses deprivatization as an incubator for controlled elites without a political voice, but with money for the economic survival of the Kremlin regime. By 2026, the number of billionaires in Russia has even grown, but they are walking on a loose wire, balancing between sanctions and loyalty to the Kremlin, without a real ability to negotiate independently. Oligarchs without reliance on their armies or on their own cadres in the armed forces are just a flower bed without flowers, and therefore, they are not in negotiations with Trump's oligarchs. As for the Trump 47 oligarchs themselves, he himself has historical ties with Russian business people, for example, through deals in the 1980s and 1990s or entourage like Paul Manafort, but by 2024-2026, these ties had weakened or had become the subject of speculation on the topic of the fabricated Russiagate. Some Russian elites pinned their hopes on Trump for normalization and easing of sanctions, seeing him as a chance to rationalize relations, but Grok AI does not record direct negotiations through oligarchs. Trump has established gold cards for wealthy investors, potentially including Russians, but this does not imply active engagement with Putin's oligarchs on Ukraine, Gaza and the Trump's route as a corridor in Central Asia to Iran, Turkey and the Arabian Peninsula. The Trump 47 administration has not lifted key sanctions against Russia, and the focus on the oligarchs as intermediaries is, alas, minimal so far. Rather, contacts go through official or informal channels like Elon Musk or the English translator Fiona Hill in conversations between Trump and Putin, but not through the business elite. As a result, Putin still has oligarchs, but as tools, not independent actors, and they're used for dialogue with Trump's darlings, or figures like Kushner and Wigkoff, is unlikely without the direct approval of the Kremlin. So far, only Denis Dmitriev with poor US English pronunciation is in plain sight. Which of the oligarchs of the Russian Federation is capable of success? I have an idea to nominate Vladimir Putin with his lithium business in Russia and Oleg Deripaska with his ability to replace lithium with aluminum through the import of bauxite from West Africa, where Oleg Deripaska has everything seized and paid for everything. This is the end of the first part, oligarchs and the military. The hierarchs and the military is the second part.
All right, my friends. So that's it. I would like you to send me your requests, your suggestions, your critiques. So I'm ready for open discussion. And wait for the second part of this very interesting topic, how rich persons and spiritual leaders identify the role of the military in peacekeeping uh, in many countries. So that's all. Bye bye.